Welcome to the Virtual Executive IT Roundtable panel, and thank you all for joining us. My name is Fred Obiero, and I'll be the host and moderator for today's webinar. I'm the Managing Director of Client Solutions and Training here at Process IT, and I'm excited to be hosting this session today. We have a great panel. I want to thank everyone for registering for this event. We normally get viewers from different parts of the world, the time difference notwithstanding, and we received a lot of questions from those that registered, so we'll be covering those in today's session. I'm not sure if we'll be able to cover all those questions, but I'll try my best to cover most of them. A recorded version of this webinar will be available on YouTube within 48 hours, and I encourage you guys to share it with your social networks once you get to view that. We'll have time set aside for some Q&A towards the end of the webinar, so for all of the live viewers, there's a questions icon at the bottom of your screen, so just use that to post your questions, and then once we get to the Q&A session, I'll start going through those. Josh and Steve, I'll do a quick introduction, then I'll let you guys provide an overview of your background and your company's side. So in today's webinar, we'll be talking to the Head of Experience Solutions Sales at VMware. We have Josh Olson, and we'll also be talking to the Global Vice President of Cloud Services at Ultimate Software, Steve May. So welcome both. Josh, I'll let you go first, so just give us a high-level overview of your role at VMware.
Thanks, Fred. So for those that don't know, VMware is a 22-year-old enterprise software company, and our CEO actually was CEO of the year in 2019, so we're really proud of that. Part of that is he's focused on servant leadership, which I can get into later, but I wanted to just kind of give those kind of framework on VMware. We're focused on virtualization and cloud, and Tanzu are some of the things that you might hear of from us, but also in the end user computing space. And what we're doing in all those cases are layers of abstraction, so we can actually deliver new experiences for folks and help our companies that we service to be more productive and efficient. And my role in head of experience is really just to kind of help all of our sales teams and customers focus on their employee experiences and how do we make those brilliant.
Awesome, thanks for that. And Steve, just give us a high level of your background and overview at Ultimate Software.
Yeah, so for sure. So hi, my name is Steven May. I'm the Global Vice President of Infrastructure and Operations, or Cloud, for Ultimate Software. And we're in a kind of a unique time right now because we've recently merged with another very large SaaS provider, Kronos. And so now going from roughly about a 6,000 employee organization to about a 12,000 employee organization as we speak has been a very unique experience for me. But essentially, both companies provide HCM, or human capital management software, for global employees. And that's having modules for different elements of the employee experience, everywhere from recruitment to retirement. So things like job boards, modules for onboarding, for HR and pay, for managing performance, time tracking, you name it, benefits. We have modules for. Ultimate Software has been around for about 30 years. Kronos has been around for about 40 years, and we're lucky to have those companies come together to provide a best-in-breed solution for our customers. So again, my role in the VP of our cloud organization, basically you can think of it as infrastructure and operations and some application operations. So private cloud, public cloud management, and then also doing things like activating our customers, ensuring that our environments are performant, scalable, secure, and that we're performing a lot of the care and feeding of the products that ride on top of our both, again, public and private clouds. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Steve. And I know you guys have a lot going, especially with the merger with Kronos, so I really appreciate you taking the time to be here with us.
You bet.
Josh, the first question will be for you. So lots of companies that are hiring new employees today are shipping out equipment to their new hires since they cannot come on site yet. And this has somehow devalued the onboarding experience that employees normally get. What approach have you implemented that can allow employees to immediately feel like a part of the team?
Great question, Fred, because when you're onboarding, that's your first exposure to the brand and the company and the culture, right? And what we realized a
Right.
few years ago, we did a study, and small improvements in onboarding led to a 12.7% increase in retention, right? So as we kind of thought through that, this is years ago when things were on site, we thought through how to do those programs differently. How do we engage you with the right people, the hiring manager, the people on your team, cross-functional teams, so you get exposure not just to the people in your organization, but across the organization, or your group, but across the organization. And some of the stuff that we realized was that if we could help with some of those things and deliver those in a digital experience, now all of a sudden we could take this program that we were doing primarily in Palo Alto, because that's where our headquarters is, we could actually do this digitally and take it across the globe in Canada and Latin America, Europe, Asia Pac, all of those areas, and deliver these new kind of experiences for onboarding. And so some of the stuff we've done, for example, you could, like you just said, drop ship a device to somebody, but in a lot of cases, what companies are doing is they're imaging these PCs, they're bringing them into, basically they have it shipped to them, and either a configurator or somebody at within IT at the company headquarters has to image it and get it just right for the user and then ship it out to the user. And there's a little bit of back and forth once the user has it to make sure everything's functional. What we've done is we've said, well, let's do what's called provisioning or modern management and do it in the same way you would do your mobile phones and make everything intuitive. And so in that end, what we did is we built this thing called a hub that then delivers that experience. And it starts by meeting the user where they're at. So when you first start at VMware, the first thing that you're going to notice is that we actually can deliver this experience to your mobile phone first. Long before you can get a PC shipped to anybody or whatever, they can get it instantaneously. And we can then start to communicate to you as a new hire and do some really brilliant things like, for example, why don't we have you choose which device you're most effective on and efficient on? Get you building in your culture with us together, because what that is our culture is actually created by the employees. So that's where we're really kind of changed the dynamic a little bit and shifted that to really enable this brilliant onboarding remotely.
Just a quick follow-up on that, Josh. How far in advance does the new employee get all these features downloaded to their phone before they actually begin working?
That's a great question. So when you think about the onboarding process, there's a phase where you're a pre-hire, right? So we can actually deliver now pre-hire kind of experiences where I'm communicating to you and delivering different videos and other things that you might need. For example, all the Ultimate software can also be delivered in that secure private container, if you will, that layer of abstraction. And then all of those other things that have to flow out of that, like, for example, depending on the role, maybe you need to get a uniform or, other things that are associated for you. All of that can be done before you actually start your official first day. And so what happens then is when you actually start, you're ready to start. So I can do things like deliver a digital badge to your phone so you can actually badge in when you walk into the door for the first time. Those are the kind of brilliant experiences we're trying to deliver that are really kind of more state of the art. And that's also kind of changing people's perception. When you first walk in the door, you know you're dealing with a modern company that's doing modern things that you want to be a part of.
That's a very interesting use case you just mentioned, because there's a lot of companies that are struggling with the onboarding part because everybody's working remote and they were not prepared for such an event. So I think there's a lot to be taken from what you just described. So thanks for sharing that.
You bet.
Steve, the next question is yours. Aside from technical and niche domain skills, what are some of the top traits that you perceive as critical to the success for cloud engineers, and why?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, so above their domain skills, what we look for are engineers that are always interested in learning, because things are changing at such a rapid pace, that are very curious, at the same time very bold to be able to challenge some of the norms that we have and some of the constraints that we have. Also being very flexible, because as everyone knows, things we're working in a new world, so being able to be flexible and adapt to the new world that we're working in is very important. Being creative, but also on top of this, it's really being able to be collaborative. So even though you might be, the one of the brightest people in your fields or your domains, you have to have the ability to really build trust with the people that you're working with, and also to be able to, through that trust and partnership, be able to influence And because that's a very important part of our engineering roles, to be out there in our local communities and also here at Ultimate, bringing that knowledge that you can bring and sharing it with the rest of the team so everyone can learn, and so that you're seen as that trusted advisor. And so when you're making those recommendations, people have trust in those recommendations.
Very good intel. That question actually came from one of our engineering consultants. So, you know, if they ever end up looking for a job with Ultimate, I think they already have part of the insight that's required for that.
Yep, thank you. Being willing to share your knowledge is a very important trait.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, Josh, the global pandemic caused by COVID-19 has resulted in the disruption of operations for lots of companies. What are the main strategies that you've employed to improve the continuity of operations?
You're exactly right. I mean, everybody had to pivot in a dime, right? It's been very stressful for a lot of organizations. One thing I am finding as a theme is a lot of organizations are actually facing consolidation in their industries now. And so M&A, mergers and acquisition, is actually a massive focus. And if you think about it, it's really a big opportunity to do onboarding at scale, because I'm doing, you know, I'm not doing one employee at a time. I might do 10,000 at a time, right? Which is a similar but different, slightly different process. And I would recommend for a framework of kind of how to assess some of these things, where you look at it holistically about a design around experience. And the first thing I would say is put it into buckets where you have the macro, the micro, and the nano. And as far as a macro scale goes, these are things that are global in nature. GDPR hit everybody in the similar kind of thing. It was global. Obviously, COVID is global. All of those things are kind of that macro level. If you go to the micro level, this is where you're at the organization level, the company level. And when you think about like companies at that perspective, how is COVID affecting this company or that company, and what's it mean to them? Are their workers effectively essential or not, or within the organization, which are and aren't? And then look at the nano and say, what's it like to be that individual that's working in this environment? Because now all of a sudden you got these really complex things happening, like my kids are home. Like, how do I deal with that? Like, when they were school's done now, but when they were both trying to do schooling, how do you balance all that? And I think that's one of the big challenges that a lot of companies are facing right now, is how to actually do that. And so what happened was a lot of companies right away, they focused on responding, do whatever we can as fast as we can. Let me just throw certain technologies that you can, take a laptop, work from home. Here's a VDI, here's whatever I can, just go. Try to be as effective as you can. Now, most companies have pivoted to this reflect stage. On the 3 stages I mentioned. I think the reflect stage is, I'm going to review and optimize and figure out, we just did stuff because we had to, but let's rationalize and think of what we should do. And how do we, if this keeps up, how do we optimize it? The rethink side is actually where I spend most of my time now with customers, is focusing on how they rethink from an HR perspective, the very roles that we do and the expectations of those roles, and how do we actually make that in such a way that can be done distributed. So a lot of companies are this kind of concept of, well, you're remote. Well, remote means you're remote from a headquarters location or a hub, if you will, right? And for those that are technical, think of like frame relay networks. Everything's got to go back through the hub and back and forth. Now we're thinking distributed, where now everybody's distributed. That's more like the internet itself, where point-to-point communication is possible. How do you make that effective? And that's really where people are starting to think now on the rethink side. How do I deliver amazing experiences such that we can up-level the skills of everybody in the organization?
And to that point, Josh, do you think now that companies are having time to rethink their strategies, do you think they can go back and redo some of the things that they did when they were more in a react mode and trying to make sure that everybody was set up to work remote, as opposed to now where they've had time to analyze the entirety of the situation? Do you think that's going to change going forward for a lot of companies?
I think that definitely. I think there's a lot of companies that are now looking at different things, like, for example, cloud software, for example, we were just talking about. And a lot of them are doing a big shift towards cloud, because if you start to think about the scalability, flexibility, and those kind of things become really pertinent, especially as you look at things like, well, if I've got to do an M&A, how do I do it quickly? How do I sunset those legacy data centers from the acquisition very quickly? Mm-hmm. Can I encapsulate all of those, because most of them are on VMs and that type of thing. I can encapsulate all those in a digital bubble and move those to a cloud. Maybe it's Amazon, Azure, Google, and I can run it on those clouds, and then sunset those data centers right away, reclaim the cost structures, et cetera, and then use that to eventually rationalize those applications I have from the parent-child organizations, and then eventually sunset certain applications as I rationalize those. But it's a quick way to start to, what happens on the experience side is now I have a delivery mechanism that's not necessarily stuck in one location, and I can then leverage it and scale it differently.
That's great. Yeah, that's a really good example. So thanks for sharing that. Steve, cloud technologies are evolving at a rapid pace, and this may lead to shortages in cloud talent in certain areas. How do you attract top talent, top IT talent, I should say, while competing with other companies for the same limited resources?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, Fred. So we've been fortunate that we've been, or Ultimate's been named the #2 best places to work by Forbes, and that's overall a #1 in technology. And so we've had many years of kind of having that brand. So we do attract a lot of folks because of that. But what that really means is having a culture that puts our people first, where diversity and inclusion is very important. And we make that known about our brand and through the onboarding and recruitment process. We offer a very flexible working environment. So having the ability to either work from some of our offices or work from home and work dynamic schedules, offering very rich benefits, such as unlimited PTO, and basically doing things like covering adoption fees or in vitro fertilization. So we go out of the way to try to determine all of the different ways that we can enrich our people's lives. And we've built our company brand around that people first mantra. Also, we offer our technical candidates the ability to work on very modern technology and the latest patterns and practices for cloud, AI, and things like that. And I think those are some of the things that kind of set us apart and allow us to compete for some of that scarce IT talent.
That's great. And I have a two-part follow-up question to that. So a follow-up and a follow-up to the follow-up.
All right.
The first part is, what are some of the most challenging roles for you to fill and why? And as a follow-up to that is, how can organizations be better prepared to fill cloud roles at an enterprise level scale when dealing with newer technologies? You just referenced some of the new technologies like AI and machine learning. So how can organizations be better prepared to fill cloud roles as they relate to those new technologies?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. So first, maybe a few years ago, finding engineers with public cloud experience was a little bit more challenging, but now that's becoming a little bit more commonplace. So I think where we're finding the challenges right now are really around SRE, site reliability engineering, and DevOps, and people that really understand the cost factors and cost controls around public clouds. And so I think that's really where the challenge is. And the reason for that, especially for things like site reliability engineering, is it's such a relatively new domain, and it requires candidates to have such a breadth of knowledge across so many different technologies. And so I think that's why that's becoming more and more challenging. And then secondarily, the second part of that question, really what are some of the practices that organizations can do to help kind of prepare for that scarcity? And so for me, that's always looking for new talent. So whether I'm going to conferences or working with some of our staffing partners or internal recruiters, it's always be on the lookout and always try to do a level of forecasting for the top talent that we think we're going to need over, let's say, the next 1 to 2 years. In addition to that, it really is having strong strategic partners with some of our staffing vendors that have a niche skill set in finding cloud resources. And there's also been a new model that's recently come out where there's certain organizations that are launching what they're calling kind of cohort or training programs. So as an example, if we're looking and we know we're going to hire, let's say 10 site reliability engineers, there are companies out there that basically can work with you, prepare a training program, put a number of candidates through this training program. Once they demonstrate a certain level of competency, then is the time that we would go ahead and hire them. So if we know that we're going to be doing, again, hiring and scale, we can work with these companies to identify the traits that we're looking for, the curriculum. These companies actually put those candidates through that training program, and then we're in a position to hire. In addition to that, we've also, over the past year and a half, have started programs like that internally as well. And so what we'll do is we'll have now, again, similar cohort programs where when we bring in candidates, technical candidates in this case, they go through a formal education program in various disciplines in the areas that we know we're going to need to hire, either currently or in the near future. And so as we have these quote unquote graduating classes, we have a pool of candidates to call upon.
That's a really great insight, Steve, because I know this question was more geared towards enterprise level strategies, but in my opinion, based on what you just said about the training, I think this applies to even small and medium-sized companies. So I really appreciate you sharing that. And furthermore, this will be beneficial for the people out there looking for jobs or wanting to get into the cloud space. I think they can partake in this training experience and make sure that they're fully competent and qualified to apply for some of these roles. So thanks for sharing that, Steve. Josh, with remote workers now becoming a part of corporate strategies, what best practice would you recommend when implementing digital workspaces in an organization?
Thanks for the question, because that's one I get a lot. Number one, I would come at it with empathy. Start with empathy, end with empathy, have empathy in the middle. Mm-hmm. But if you have the right level of empathy, you start to become human and realize that we're dealing with humans, which I know sounds ridiculous, but so many things we do in technology almost get to the point where we're delivering something to you because we assume you're going to use it one way. We haven't talked to you and we just deliver it and go. And the difference here is if you have the empathy, you start to really think through things like, hey, workers have kids at home or they have elderly parents. What's it like? Well, they're scared to go back to work. And so if you start to think about going back to work, it's not just that they're scared for themselves, they're scared for their family. They also are trying to juggle this because now are the kids going back to school or not? Like different areas of the world and country, right? They have different rules around go back to work. You can go back, but your kids you have to stay home. They're like, well, how am I going to do that? Right? All of that kind of stuff has to be factored into how you're doing some of these things, return to work solutions. The other thing is there's also this concept of contact tracing. And then what we're developing, which is called fixed point tracing, which is also a good way to bring people back. In our case, we put privacy as a paramount thing for all the employees and anybody that uses our software, right? Because what we want to be able to do is ensure your privacy is there. So we have this concept called Privacy Guard. And what we're doing with fixed point tracing is we're not using peer-to-peer kind of tracing as much as what it's doing is it's actually understanding that I went to a conference room and that conference room has a Bluetooth beacon. You went to that conference room, has a beacon, and it's logging it on our individual devices. At no time there's personally identifiable information being shared. And what that allows us to do then is if I contract, COVID and I say, I've got COVID, what it can do, Fred, is just simply alert you, but it didn't tell you that I had it. It just says, hey, that beacon that we both went past, it got sick. So then it's kind of keeping it separated. Those are the kind of the things that I mean by empathy, is getting kind of deep into that empathy and then understand how to leverage tools like bring your own device, because that gets so important because we're assuming everybody's sitting at a desk and here's your PC. And, a lot of companies think that way. I challenge that often and say, well, yes, but we all have personal devices and phones and smart devices. As a matter of fact, there's 11 times more phones than there are tablets and PCs put together globally, which is, again, it's a big stat, but I love to bring it up. Even if you're an information worker, by the way, 60% of the time, you're not sitting in front of your desk. So how in the heck are you supposed to consume the intranet update around COVID? You can't, right? Unless you're VPN'd in and you're not going to do that on a phone, all of those things. Just think of that friction and think of how you can remove that by starting with empathy.
You mentioned something about bring your own device. Do you think there's a risk of, decreased productivity if some of the employees are utilizing devices that don't really measure up when it comes to the speed at which they have to work or compatibility with some of the applications? Do you think that's a risk that companies should think about?
Yeah, so what you're saying makes sense, right? So I could have a device that doesn't have the horsepower, so to speak, to do the job the right way. However, I can also tell you that there's different ways of getting around that from a technology perspective, to the point that I can give you a super high horsepower laptop that actually ends up being heavy and you got to lug it around. Or I can actually give you a lighter one that actually then leverages a virtual desktop in a cloud, which then I'm not actually moving these giant CAD files or other giant files that you might be working on, depending on your role. That's actually a more optimized way of doing it. And now what I can leverage is all the GPUs that are all that power, right? I might have a bunch of GPUs in a data center somewhere that then can really drive productivity for the workforce. And frankly, there's a lot less frustration because you're not lugging around something super heavy. But those are the kind of things that you kind of just, again, think through from an be empathetic, and then say, well, what's it really like? What would you really like to work on? And how do you really want to work? And actually, in a lot of those cases, if you start to do the follow the sun kind of development work, depending on, I'm assuming we're talking about developers, but if you start to think that through, if I don't have to move the core data set, which is a massive amount of data, and simply remoting into it, it becomes a lot more productive over time.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's the direction that technology is moving, for this, especially when everybody is always connected to the internet these days. So there's no point, just like I said, in dragging around heavy equipment when all you have to do is just log in, and through an application, you have access to all your work stuff, regardless of the location of where you're logging in from. So that's great.
Yeah, and you bring up a good point, because if I'm not actually, if I can have that freedom now, and I can work from anywhere, now that actually changes a lot of different things, including like economic opportunities for folks, because now I don't have to have you in the Bay Area. I can actually have you work anywhere. And we did a study that costs, in real estate alone, it's going to cost me about $13,000 a year just for a cubicle area for you to work. If you move that person to Atlanta, it's like 9,000. So there's a huge cost difference just by doing that. All of that goes away if you can work from home. And by the way, wherever your home is, let's say your home's in Montana, well, it's wildly cheaper to live there than in the Bay Area, right? So it becomes a benefit to you and the company by figuring out how to be flexible like that.
That's a good one. All right. Steve, what are some of the upcoming trends in cloud computing that you are closely monitoring that you predict will become relevant in the near term? I know you talked about some of the new technologies that cloud engineers like working on. What are some of the ones that you envision will be becoming mainstream over the next few years?
Yeah, so I think some of the common ones that are starting to emerge now, I think many people have heard of, but we're keeping a close eye. Like we made a big investment in Kubernetes as kind of the next generation kind of cloud platform overall, or at least the cloud enabling technology, I should say. Functions as a service is also something we're keeping our eyes close on. Machine learning continues to develop. We have big investments there, but we're closely watching where that's going to go and where it's going to take us. And then also a lot of vendors are starting to invest heavily in hybrid cloud offerings. So being able to move workloads and services and data between not only the different big public cloud providers, but also private data centers. So continuing to watch a lot of what the vendors are offering in terms of hybrid cloud offerings.
You talk about hybrid cloud offerings. What about situations where companies are using a multi-cloud platform approach? Do you see any benefits in doing that? Because a lot of customers are normally worried about data loss or disaster situations where they're not fully set up to have business continuity in the event that disaster happens.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think, whether you call it multi-cloud or hybrid cloud, I think that also depends on the organization's requirements. So there's a lot of different use cases for multi-cloud. Some people look at it in terms of avoiding vendor lock-in, so they're not stuck to just one cloud provider. A lot of people look at multi-cloud to do things like taking advantage of the strengths of some of the different cloud providers and being able to spread those workloads where some of those cloud providers have the most strength in terms of, like, as an example, like AI and machine learning. Some cloud providers have stronger capabilities. So you can take advantage of that expertise from that cloud provider, but also maybe taking advantage of some of the other like data backing services and some of the other cloud providers. So it gives you a lot of flexibility. I know for us, some of that was DR, is being able to put DR into the most cost-effective public cloud possible to move workloads from our private data centers to public in the event of a DR scenario. But we also looked at it as we launched new products to new markets. It was easier to go to market on a public cloud provider versus building our own data center. But then as we would reach critical mass, if it made more sense to build our own data centers from a cost perspective, our multi-cloud strategy gave us the flexibility to do that. So again, it really depends on the different use cases, and there's a lot out there, but those are just some of the ones that we've experienced.
Well, that's great. And I like those use cases because based on some of the research that I do and also conversations that I have with different people in leadership positions when it comes to the cloud space, those are some of the key things that they mentioned. So thanks for sharing those. Sure. Josh, employee experience impacts everything from corporate culture to the bottom line of organizations, as you've alluded to earlier. What lessons can you share on how to improve employee experience, especially in current situations where teams are spread out remotely?
So when we're looking at employee experience, the way we look at it is there's three pillars to it. There's obviously the technology side of things, there's the cultural, and then there's the physical. And so when we try to design solutions and software around it, we try to think about it holistically. And I know you're thinking, what's this software stuff got to do with a physical environment and all that stuff? But as you start to think through this, you start to go transitioning because of COVID to remote. Actually, for us, was not that big of deal from a ability to continue to work remotely. For us, actually, what happened for one time, it was a Friday. We're on an all hands call. We're getting updates on what we're going to do because we're traveling to Vegas for a big sales conference on Monday. And during that call, we get the live update. This just in, da 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 da. You know, the music's playing and the whole thing, and we gotta give you this news update. And the news update was literally because of COVID. Like, this just hit everybody all at the same time. We're not going to be traveling on Monday. Go cancel all your flights and everything else. Excuse me. What happens is because we've unified the experiences, and this is kind of the advice I would give, is unify those experiences that you can. We have something called Workspace One Hub where we unify all of the experiences, all of the interaction you might have for your job is all unified in one location. That means things like digital badge, single sign-on to all your apps and content, even the intranet with the VPN baked in, so I don't even have to launch a VPN. It's all just right there, and I get all my notifications that way as well, and I can click on things and take actions from those notifications. For example, I had to pivot so that Monday I no longer had that flight in the hotel room and all that jazz. We got an alert. You click the alert, it was able to cancel that. On the back end, it's speaking to our Concur travel system, right, and travel and expense, and it took care of all that for me. But I was able to get the alert, take quick action, and then get back to what I was doing for my job because, frankly, I had to present on Monday, and I had to change everything I was presenting. So there was honestly, people had to work a little bit through the weekend to make it happen. It wasn't that easy, but the technology was there, and we were able to, because of this unification of how we do all of the corp comms and everything through this unified way of doing it, all of those things could very quickly pivot. And also the other thing I was going to mention is we have a lot of self-service support and remote assistance, as well as like a people directory, all embedded in this hub, which allows us to very quickly then go, oh yeah, I was going to meet so-and-so at the event prior to the presentation. I better call them. What's their number, or how do I get in contact with them? All of those things for we've got about 30,000+ people now. How do I know who's who, and how do I get a hold of them quickly? That's the kind of stuff that, again, you could have done at a physical event, but here I'm like, what do I do? I click on the people directory and I'm able to get to them right away and take action on how are we going to change our presentation, right? But those kind of things are what I would recommend, is to unify the experience, make it transparent to the employees as much as possible, and almost over communicate, because that's the only way to connect again with people remotely.
It sounds to me like the unifying the experience is taking together a whole lot of different applications and putting them all together so that in the use case you just provided, the example you just provided where you got a notification and all you had to do is just do one click and you were able to cancel the flight that you had coming out to go to Vegas. For that kind of scenario, do companies have to build that on their own, or are there third-party application developers that will be taking care of some things like that?
Yeah, you actually, yeah, it depends on how integrated you want to make it. For example, a lot of the standardized software, for example, a lot of cloud softwares have a lot of APIs, and you can just simply integrate to those APIs, right? So all of this unification of the notifications and what we call action, we call them mobile workflows, you can actually click on those and make those happen because those API calls are there and established and you just have to configure it. And yes, there are companies that can do that for you, but you can even go further. And let's say you're building applications internally, you can leverage an SDK from us to be able to do that for all your internal applications as well. That's going to be a little bit more involved, obviously, because you know how your application works and there's not just always APIs to draw upon. You got to kind of build some of that stuff, but yes, you can actually build that. And I would actually recommend, it's around that kind of low code, no code kind of thought process. I would recommend anybody looking into that area of experience to go deeper into that, because there's going to be a lot more jobs and other things in that area, because that's driving the entire workforce's productivity up.
So are you guys using low code as part of your technology stack?
We actually have a lot of APIs and other things that are a part of it. But what I'm saying is that whole development area is where now there's opportunities for third-party developers as well as internal staff to start developing really impressive, take these legacy applications that have been around forever, ERP systems and others, and start to build really impressive experiences that can really make things better for people on a factory floor or a trucking and shipping organization. You can transform how they're doing what they're doing.
That's wonderful. Thanks. Steve, the economic impact of the pandemic has caused many companies to go through furloughs and layoffs. As an executive, how do you keep your employees focused on productive despite the issues resulting from the pandemic?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so, I think regardless of your organization's financial status, I think what was important for us is to truly understand and model out what would be some different scenarios, and basically be transparent about the financial health and what that impact of some of those different scenarios would be on our people. And we've been lucky enough that we weren't in a position where we would had to perform any layoffs or furloughs. But basically our strategy was really to over communicate. So our senior executives were communicating with all of our 12,000 plus people almost on a weekly basis in terms of the status of the impact on the organization and basically our plans for go forward. At the same time, we were launching a lot of enrichment programs. So whether that was health and wellness programs, virtual health and wellness programs for people, or child enrichment programs, basically learning and entertainment for the children of our employees, and also gave opportunities to give back to the community. So we actually had several cells and groups of employees that started to 3D print masks and sew masks so they can give those back to the community. So it was really to understand, going back to, I think what Josh was saying, is really to have a true understanding of all of our people, have that empathy, understand what everyone's going through, and try to do everything that we could to over communicate and provide as much information as we could on such a regular basis has been essential for us, and to show them that we're trying to do everything that we can to accommodate everyone's kind of new dynamic work style.
Yeah, you guys both hit the nail on the head when you talked about empathy, because at the end of the day, if the employees feel like their leaders are valuing them and care for their well-being, not just their productivity at work, but also their mindset and making sure that everything is fine. Steve, you just mentioned the transparency part where you guys over communicated to let them know that, hey, we're here with you. Nobody's going to be impacted by this. We'll keep you posted. I think with that kind of approach, it always helps them feel like they're part of the family, part of the fabric of the corporate culture. And it's no surprise to me why Forbes ranked Ultimate #2 on Forbes 100 list. So that's a good example that you just provided.
Thank you.
Josh, companies are looking for ways to streamline costs while increasing employee efficiency and productivity. How would you ensure that your end users and partners stay productive as they were prior to implementing virtualization or virtual tools?
There's really two ways to address costs. For example, you can lower costs or you can increase profits. And you're like, yes, I know. But what I'm saying there is you can do a couple of things, right? So in a lot of cases, companies have multiple systems to manage because they're trying to secure, the goal here is to give you a productive environment. But to do that, you might have a phone, you might have a PC or a Mac or something like that. I have different ways of managing all those different tools. I have different ways of managing and delivering all of your applications to you. And so there ends up being all this additional layers that you have to manage. And what we're doing is we're actually helping companies to consolidate all of that on the back end and deliver it differently from an IT perspective as well. So studies we've done have actually shown that it's 2/3 less expensive. So you're saving 2/3 of the cost structure by consolidating that back end into one unified management platform. And then on top of that, the other way to look at it is to increase profits, where, like I was just mentioning before, like if you can improve worker productivity, you actually get a gain across the entire workforce. So for example, there's this thing called context switching where I'm moving in between different applications. And for managers within VMware, we did something where we actually abstracted the approval process out of multiple different applications. They had 30 different applications they had to do different approvals in, and they would log into each application. And what we wound up finding, it would take like 2 weeks to get the approvals done, typically on average. Part of that was because of the friction was there, the digital friction. You'd have to be VPN'd in, you'd go into this particular application, you'd go to the third screen, second section, fill out what you needed to, log out of that one, do the same thing over and over 30 times. And they'd wait till Saturday morning, basically, all the executives that were traveling around to do all those approvals. What we did is we abstracted that and delivered it in a different way that you could consume wherever you are on whatever device you happen to be on, and consume that in that hub that I was talking about, where now all of a sudden I can very quickly, when I go back to the airport, I can stand in line at the airport and do my approvals for my team and get those knocked out of the way. That does a couple of things. One, there's that 20% loss to context switching going in and out of apps. Basically, I'm in Hub, I just knock it out and I get it done. There isn't that context switching problem. But beyond that, because I've taken all these boring, mundane tasks and just knocked them out of the way for myself, but also all workers, because all of us have compliance reports or something that we need to do. Yes, I want you to fill out the Sarbanes-Oxley compliance report. That's very important. We, as a society, we really want that done. What that's done from the nano level, from the employee level, like, great, another TPS report to fill out, right? And so if we can make all that stuff easier and a lot more actionable, all of a sudden you get all that mundane, boring stuff out of the way. Like when you wake up in the morning, grab your phone, knock all that stuff out of the way. By the time you get to your desktop, your Mac or PC, right, that's where you get to do your creative time. And that's where human, again, we're not robots. So because we're humans, we want to be creative and do great things. That's where you're able to do those big things on that bigger screen. And studies have shown there that actually drives a 4x profitability increase, right? So again, there's two ways: reduce the costs by 2/3 or increase the profits by 4x.
That's a wonderful example. And I like that because it doesn't really involve cutting down on headcount, but it's just innovative things that they can look and see how they can become more efficient in what they already perform. So that's a good one. I want to start taking some questions from the audience. Steve, I have one for you here. So how has the cloud computing industry transformed roles within your organization at Ultimate Software? Have system admins turned into SREs? You talked about the site reliability engineers and how that's become difficult to fill. And also have developers turned into DevOps? And then a follow-up to that is, are employees being retrained on new skills?
Yeah, that's a great question. So first I'll talk about the sysadmin. So in at least for us here at Ultimate Software, we still have a big investment in our private data centers and public cloud as well. But so for like your traditional sysadmins that have maybe historically have worked with like network storage and compute, their roles have been evolving, some into site reliability engineering, but also
Mm-hmm.
there's still a need for that skill set. But what's happening there, at least for us, is there's an evolution into treating infrastructure as code, where traditionally a lot of those sysadmins would have hands on consoles to configure, again, network storage and compute. Now what's happening is we have retrained our engineers to adopt this practice of infrastructure as code, where you're managing infrastructure as if it were code. That means you're doing the automation, you're configuring it in code, it's version controlled, you're checking it into a source code repository. You can actually deploy that infrastructure just like you would deploy an application, i.e. via the click of a button. And if there's an issue or something needs to be rolled back, you can easily click that button and roll back to a prior version. So that's, in that more traditional system admin world, that's kind of the evolution that's happening there, leveraging tools like Terraform as an example. But certainly on the developer front, a lot of, we've been going through an evolution by converting a lot of our feature writing developers into more of that full stack or DevOps developer. And also at the same time, being that we hire so much, that is the skill set that we are looking to hire in when we're hiring developers is folks that not only know how to develop the features, but also know how to manage the operational concerns like doing deployments and worrying about things like DR and performance and availability, not only, again, just writing their features. So that has been that, we've seen that evolution probably for the last maybe like 7 or 8 years, and that continues to evolve. And then yes, at every opportunity, as we decide as an organization to adopt some of these new patterns and practices, by all means, we do have a culture of training, not only where we provide formal training, but we have guilds and communities where some of the SMEs can share that information and those patterns and practices and what's working and what's not working with the other folks in the organization.
And that's great. And I think by the sharing of good and bad things that are happening, it avoids some of those mistakes from being repeated. And, I think overall you guys are growing and moving in the right direction. So that's great.
Yeah.
Josh, I have a question for you from the Q&A. Do you think the companies that are new to remote work and are now having the metrics that prove success via remote may continue to have employees working, from home after the pandemic?
Without question, yes. What we're finding is that the pandemic sped up, and we were talking a little bit about this before, Fred, it sped up the amount of work that was done. It feels like 10 years happened in 3 months. I think you're spot on with that, because what's happened is this technology, I don't want to date myself, but I kind of will. About 18 years ago, 20 years ago maybe, I was selling the internet, access to the internet. And yes, you had to do that at one point in time. Okay. But I was selling to companies to be able to do that kind of thing because we had all these concepts around what it would mean for companies and the great things that they could do with it, and distance learning and telemedicine and all of those things that you hear of now. It's just taken about 20 years for folks to kind of come to grips with it. There's been so much institutional friction to it, like even in the government, the federal and the what we call state and local education, higher ed, all of those kind of groups. I work across all of that. And what I'm learning is that there's a lot more willingness to change policies, and they're doing so because if you think about it from a government perspective, their revenues are down, tax revenues are down because companies aren't producing revenues, right? That kind of thing. What's happening though is then it gets down to the municipality level, and they're going, I can't afford workers, I got to lay them off. What am I going to do, right? And so when that happens, you have certain services and you're like, well, how do I deliver the service? I got to lay these people off. What am I doing? And what they're able to start doing is they're starting to change their thinking around it, saying, okay, you have to live downtown. You have to be a part of this community, all of those kind of things. There's some advantages to that, but there's also some advantages to certain roles. If you're going to be tax accounting and that kind of thing, do I need you sitting in downtown, or can you work from your home? And if you do that, there's a different cost structure, like I was mentioning before. All of a sudden, all of that is getting visible really quick to all the CFOs. As a matter of fact, the majority of CFOs per CFO magazine, right? They're all looking at the cost structures, trying to figure out how do they get through it, because the revenues are down, and they're trying to figure out how to get through it with the cost structures. And one of the things they're looking at is real estate costs and how do they right size their real estate. Barclays Bank, for example, was online talking about how globally one of the things they're doing is they're saying, I don't need those offices with 7,000 people in them anymore. One, they're a problem financially for but there's also a health problem because they have so many people at potentially you're putting all your intellectual property and people at risk in one location. And all of a sudden you start to think about it, you're kind of single threaded. Like, man, if somebody gets COVID and they walk around the office one day, the entire 7,000 people could get it and you're kind of out of business, right? So what they're starting to realize is, well, why don't I just rethink this remote work thing and enable people differently? And you know what? If you do want to work in an office, I have branch offices, let you work over there. Let me figure out how to be flexible. And that kind of gets to delivering digital experiences like the digital badge I was talking about. And just allowing you to go very quickly going, oh, I'm going to give you a digital badge that allows you to go to these branch offices and no longer go to downtown New York City kind of thing, right? And it's just rethinking a lot of that. That's really changing right now to the point that at VMware, we thought pre-COVID, we were going to extend a lot more jobs. We knew this trend was coming, by the way. 94% of people say that they would want to work from home, at least part-time if they could, due to all sorts of reasons, right? Sick kids or whatever, right? But one of the things that we realized was we had about 10,000 we want to grow to 50,000 people. We had about 10,000 of them that we were planning that would be remote. That has pivoted to now we're expecting actually upwards of 60, 70% of the company being remote because of all these other factors that I mentioned. And by the way, productivity has gone up. I don't know if that's the little detail that I should probably throw in there.
Yeah.
Companies are seeing that.
Yeah.
CFOs are seeing that, and CFOs are now investing their dollars where they see the growth.
Absolutely, and that's one thing that those studies that have been published within weeks that have shown that companies are finding their employees are working even longer hours as they work from home because there's no commute time to the office. You know, instead of working 8 hours, people are working 10, 11 hours. And I think, like you said, CFOs are noticing that, and people are becoming more and more open to the employees working remote. Steve, I'm curious to get your feedback on that as well, because I know you guys have a lot of consultants and employees that, you know, have the opportunity to work remote. But do you think that this is going to be a trend that's going to continue, you know, post the pandemic, or are we going to shift back to people being on site?
Yeah, great question. I think it's a little too early to answer for the organization or my organization, but those are very similar. A lot of the same questions that Josh was just talking about are the questions that we're asking. Like, we've seen the benefit of not having the extensive, you know, travel and expense cost and a lot of the other costs associated with having offices or just travel in general. But it is something that we are looking at before. So roughly we had about a 48% virtual workforce prior to, but this is certainly causing us to kind of take a look back at what do we want that position to be going forward. And we are, again, running some of those financial models, seeing some of those potential benefits. And we're also seeing the same things that you guys were mentioning, a significant uptick in productivity. So I'm not exactly sure what the future is going to hold yet, but it is leaning in towards that more virtual workforce, even more so than we had before, for sure.
That's great. Yeah. And that's what we're seeing, even with some of the clients that we work with. There's a big trend in their flexibility, you know, to allow people to work remote, at least full time for the foreseeable future. And Fred, I know we almost run out of time. No,
Fred,
go ahead.
Real quick, one more thing to add, just for people to think about, is there's also the environmental impact, because we got a lot less cars and that type of thing. But also in the Bay Area, for example, people had 2-hour commutes, and it was driving them nuts, right? You end up, as a HR person, being able to tap into different pools of talent now, which again allows you to do all sorts of great things, like tap into more diverse talent pool. And that's great for a lot of different reasons, because now you're able to develop technologies for a broader audience and get broader market share and everything else. So there's a lot of great things that can happen from that.
Absolutely.
Okay. We only have 2 minutes. I'll take one last question from the audience, and then we'll wrap it up. And this will be for you, Steve. As a data scientist, are you expected to know several languages? And if so, which languages would you recommend to use as your foundation? Is it Python, R, SQL, or Java?
Yeah, so the funny thing enough here at Ultimate is actually we have folks that are actually developing in a lot of different technologies, because we do provide that flexibility here that to explore using different technologies to fit the particular use case that makes the most sense. So yeah, Python, I would say more than anything else, though, is the prominent language that I think that in terms of distribution that we're using here at Ultimate. But what we're also starting to see is where maybe about 2 or 3 years ago, we were doing a lot of our own development. We have started to explore leveraging a lot of the native capabilities that are coming out of some of the cloud providers like Google in this case. And so we are kind of at this interesting inflection point right now where, again, historically we would do a lot of our own development, but now we are exploring, can we get to market quicker with learning some of the, with using some of the tools that are built in or being provided by some of the big cloud providers. And I think our answer going forward will be a little bit of both, like where it makes the most sense, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's good. All right. I know we've run out of time. We only have a minute left, and Josh has to jump off. So thank you, Steve and Josh, for being here. It's been a pleasure having you today. And thanks to all the participants as well for sending in your questions and also for being here with us. We have our next webinar coming up on the 30th of this month. So please connect with us on LinkedIn and register for all our future events. That's all for today. So bye, everyone.
Thank you, Fred. Thanks, Steve.
Take care, guys.
All right, bye.